Welcome, sleepy traveler. You've arrived at a quiet space made just for you. My name is Valarie, and I am here to guide you gently into rest, to help ease your mind, soften your body, and drift you toward a peaceful, uninterrupted sleep. Whether your day was long or your thoughts feel a little too loud tonight, let this be your permission to slow down, to breathe, and to simply be. There's nothing more to do now. Just allow my voice to be your guide as we begin this gentle journey toward deep, nourishing rest. If you're new here, subscribe for sleep content like this, and like this video if you find it enjoyable. Let's begin. Close your eyes and allow yourself to settle into a comfortable position. Feel the weight of the day slowly softening, as if it were being lifted away. Notice the way your body naturally knows how to find rest once you give it permission. You have arrived in this moment, and there is nothing else you need to do. The night has opened its arms to you, and you are safe here. Breathe in gently through your nose, letting the breath feel cool and soft. Exhale slowly through your mouth, releasing tension with every breath out. With each inhale, feel yourself drawing in calmness. With each exhale, feel yourself letting go of anything heavy, anything unnecessary. This breath is a bridge between the waking day and the gentle night. Imagine your breath as a wave upon the shore, endlessly returning and retreating. The wave rises with the inhale, lifting you gently. The wave recedes with the exhale, carrying your stress far away. You are floating upon this tide of breath, supported and calm. There is no rush here, only the rhythm of peace. As your body rests more deeply, feel the surface beneath you holding you with ease. There is nothing you must hold on to, for the ground itself carries you. Your shoulders release their burden. Your arms grow heavy and soft. Your hands loosen, each finger uncurled and free. Notice your legs, heavy yet comfortable, sinking into stillness. Your feet relax, each toe surrendering to rest. Even the smallest muscles soften, as if they have been waiting for this permission. Now turn your awareness to your thoughts. Perhaps they still move quickly, circling like leaves caught in a breeze. Do not chase them. Do not try to hold them still. Simply notice them as if you are watching clouds drift across a wide sky. Each cloud passes just as each thought will. You are the sky itself, vast, unshaken, endlessly spacious. With each breath, imagine yourself stepping further into the quiet sanctuary of night. The doorway to rest is already open. All you must do is walk through. Picture yourself standing in a serene meadow under a sky full of stars. The grass beneath you is soft, cool, and welcoming. The stars above sparkle with gentle light, as if they are watching over you. A quiet breeze brushes across your skin, carrying the scent of night blossoms. The air is safe, calm, timeless. You take a step forward and feel a path forming beneath your feet. It is a path of ease leading you deeper into peace. Each step is lighter than the last, as though you are being carried forward. You do not have to know where the path leads. You only have to trust that it is guiding you home to rest. The meadow begins to glow softly, as though the earth itself is alive with quiet light. This light wraps around you like a warm blanket of reassurance. You are deeply safe, deeply at peace. Your breath deepens without effort. The air feels cool as it enters, warm as it leaves. Breath after breath, you are drifting closer to stillness. In the distance, you notice a small stream flowing through the meadow. Its waters shimmer with the reflection of moonlight. You walk toward it, each step slower, softer, more relaxed. The sound of the water is like a lullaby, endlessly flowing, endlessly soothing. You kneel beside the stream and dip your hand gently into the water. The water is cool, refreshing, and calming. It washes away any lingering weight within you, leaving only lightness. You sit beside the stream listening. The world is quiet here. The stars above, the earth below, and the water beside you all move in harmony. They whisper the same message. It is time to rest. Allow that message to flow through you now. It is time to rest. It is safe to rest. Your body knows how to let go. Your mind knows how to release. Your heart knows how to soften into peace. You are surrounded by night's gentle embrace. Nothing is required of you. You are enough exactly as you are in this moment. Let go of the weight of yesterday. Release the thought of tomorrow. This moment is all that matters. This breath, this stillness, this peace. Imagine a soft glow spreading from your heart, radiating warmth through your whole body. The glow moves outward, filling you with gentle comfort. Every part of you is embraced by this healing light. Every part of you is safe. Drift deeper now into the quiet of night. Feel yourself moving inward like a boat carried gently down a calm river. There is no effort, no resistance, only flow. The river carries you into rest, into the soft unfolding of dreams. Let your breath guide you. Inhale, peace. I didn't come here to fall in love with the sky. I came to disappear into it, quietly, like a paper boat drawn into the throat of a river, until the city, the school, and the long ache of an almost life vanished into weather. But the sky has a way of writing back when you start paying attention. The cottage waits at the end of a lane that barely believes it exists. The hedges lean over like old ladies listening for gossip. Stones huddle in the low fence, and a single birch tree trembles in any breeze, as though startled by its own leaves. When I step out of the car, the gravel scrapes and sighs, and I feel the sound in my ribs. My grandmother's cottage is smaller than I remember and more tender, like a pocket you forgot you had and now find is lined with something soft. I set my bag down on the step and rest my hand on the old green door, flaking, familiar, and I imagine it recognizes me. "Hello?" I say to no one, then to the birch, then to the sky. I'm back. Inside, the light is slow, as if cautious. Dust hangs above the floorboards, stitching little ladders between sun and wood. The kitchen has the same square window over the sink with its crooked latch, the same enamel teapot chipped at the spout. The smell is of something gentle and sweet, lavender and apple peel and the mild iron scent of rain-soaked stone. I swallow. I am 33 and trying to become a ghost of myself for a while. An art teacher, excused from the full-time theater of discipline and delight. A sabbatical, the letter said, for renewal, exploration, research. The truth is, I couldn't keep teaching color theory when my own life had bleached itself to grayscale. I couldn't keep telling teenagers that the opposite of blue is not sadness, it's orange, and that contrast is a gift, not a punishment. I move through the rooms like I'm re-meeting an old friend. The main room is a square of weathered bookshelves and low beams made from some old tree that is still, somehow breathing. The sofa sags with a memory of bodies. The hearth is a black mouth. The iron kettle inside it turned belly up like a turtle. I set my suitcase by the stairs and push open the window beside the nook, my grandmother's window seat, where she used to sit with her knitting and the radio and a weather eye on the orchard. The cushion there is faded to rose gray. Someone, some earlier version of me, perhaps 8 years old, knee-socked and wide-eyed, once spilled grape juice here. The faint bloom of it is still visible if you know where to look. Outside the glass, the clouds stack in soft ladders, the kind you dream you can climb if you just breathe right. They look like bread dough just before it rises. I let the window slip upward, and a cool note slips in. Somewhere a rooster crows, belated, opinionated. I smile. I don't know what time roosters are supposed to make declarations, but I cheer for the late ones anyway. The plan is simple. I will live easy. I will paint. I will sleep. I will make soups from the vegetables that the neighbor leaves in the wooden crate on the porch. I will not speak my ex's name out loud. I will relearn my own handwriting. I will start by cleaning because cleaning is a ritual, and I want to earn the quiet. The afternoon agrees to be gentle while I open cupboards, stack plates, fold dish towels into obedient squares. I sweep more for the sound than the debris. I find behind a jar of cloves and a rubber-banded bundle of recipe cards one of my grandmother's shopping lists: soap, matches, apples, cardamom, thread. I tuck it into my pocket like a charm. Between trips to the broom closet and the sink, I keep glancing at the window seat and at that particular slice of sky beyond it. When you are newly alone, your eyes search for reliable horizons. The window seat lifts, as it always has, its lid attached by 2 iron hinges and a stubborn nail that squeals. Inside are quilts, a rolled rug like a cinnamon stick, a scatter of buttons glossy with disuse. This is the place where treasures go to take deep naps. I pull the top quilt out. It smells like someone who loves you from far away. And then a second, lighter one. Beneath them, tucked on the left as if shying away from attention, lies a leather-bound notebook the color of damp soil. Weather, 1973, 1986, reads the title in a hand I don't recognize, neat and simple, pressed into the leather with a patient stylus. I pause. Something knocks in my chest, curiosity or hunger, or that quiet door you think is locked and isn't. I run my thumb along the spine. The leather has known 1,000 little storms of touch and still holds itself together. I climb up onto the window seat with the book in my lap and my knees drawn under me, the way I used to sit when my grandmother told stories about the fox she called Mr. Pine and the woman with the red bicycle who rescued a basket of ducklings. I open the journal, and the first page is exactly what the cover promised. January 6th, 1973. Cloudy, light snow, wind east by northeast. The handwriting is careful and almost bashful, the way people write when someone else might someday look. I flip through the first year. Notes march on in the same steady script, a spare kind of poetry. Blue noon, fog in low pockets, sun on the iced fence like bright wire. Occasionally there's a number, 68 degrees Fahrenheit, -2 degrees Celsius. A neat and orderly life eaten in bites of temperature. I should be disappointed. I am not. There is something oddly intimate about the smallness of such attention. You could decide to catalog anything: types of birds, stages of grief, the number of times your own name feels like a stranger in your mouth. And you would still end up recording the weather. That's how big it is and how close. I read a week in spring. Showers, damp socks, street smells of earth. I can picture the person behind the words. A kettle on the stove, a pencil sharpened to a lovely mean point, a wrist learning the weight of every hour. I turn a page and a pressed fern falls into my lap. It has lost its green but not its courage, bones and lace. I slide it back between the pages, not sure yet whether I am a thief. I read until the light shifts and the window cools against my calf. I've forgotten how comfortable a cottage can be when it chooses you. When I reach the midsummer of 1974, I stumble on a different kind of note. Found the cat in the rafters again. The first mention of a creature. Wind plays with the birch like a pickpocket. I grin. Someone is taking liberties with language. Someone is letting weather bleed into story. I make tea and return with a chipped mug. I graze. 1975, 1978. The rhythm of observation picks up small footnotes. Neighbor's boy rode a red bicycle down the lane. First frost nipped the pumpkins at the big farm. Apples so heavy the tree bent like a bow. It's still weather, but it's weather as seen through a pair of eyes willing to love. I am happy in this smallness. I am happy in the exactly what it says it is. And yet, in the back third of the book, the tone shifts entirely. The handwriting is the same but unbuttoned. The entries grow warmer, longer, and the weather starts to sound like a person. She laughed today like sunlight breaking through fog. I read the line twice. Then I set my mug carefully down because my hands are suddenly traitors. Rain on the roof. She hummed while making soup. I never felt warmer. The next page. Fog in the orchard. Her hair, a lantern. The temperature is still there. 54 degrees Fahrenheit. But it has become almost an apology beside the pulse of these sentences. Thunder at a distance. We watched it together and said nothing that wasn't needed. Weather, yes, but also the shape of two lives leaning toward each other. The page after that. Wind through the eaves, the smell of cinnamon on her wrists. The truth blooms slowly, like bread. This isn't just a record of sky. It's a record of a heart learning its own barometer. I look up too quickly and the room tilts, dizzy with context I do not have. Who wrote this? My grandmother's hand, no. Someone older, someone careful. I think of my grandmother at this table, bent over her knitting, the radio muttering about farm reports. She never told me about any she who made soup here and hummed. Or perhaps she did. And I, a child then, filed the person under kind neighbor instead of beloved. My own heart is unhelpfully tender. 2 months ago, I was still making lists on the back of napkins with someone who swore we were a team, who liked to press his face into my neck while I graded charcoal portraits and tell me I smelled like the first day of school. We were almost engaged in the way storms are almost rain. There was a ring once. There was a row once. There were 1,000 tiny meteorological events between those two things. After the last one, I packed my suitcase like you stack weather alerts and left before I could weaken into the old forecast. "You're running away," he said. "I'm running toward," I said, trying to pretend toward what wasn't an empty column on a form. Now here is this journal with its plain, clean face turned up to me. It feels like it knows something about the exact ache of leaving and the fragile wonder of arriving. I set my fingers on the leather and think about the person who wrote, I never felt warmer. Who was the I and who was the she? Why is the temperature noted at all when the room was clearly already burning? I pull a wool blanket around my shoulders and turn back to the beginning of the romantic turn, reading slowly, as if I might miss a bird if I blinked too hard. Spring. Sunlight spilled on her collarbone, a little lake I wanted to swim in. Then a more technical note below. High of 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Summer. We ate tomatoes over the sink and laughed like we had stolen something. Autumn. I showed her the winter sweaters. She tried on the red one and looked like a weather warning. Winter. We fell asleep listening to the storm brewing like an old argument, woke to a white hush. Somewhere along the way, the cottage I thought of as a small green lifeboat becomes a stage where someone else's love once stood and sang. It doesn't feel like an invasion. It feels like inheritance. Like being given a box of old paints, all of them still wet enough for new work. There are no names, no dear, no beloved, no M. The journal is more meteorology than correspondence, a barometer of two. But the pronouns are stubborn and bright, and my mind begins to photograph rooms and imagine whose coat might have hung on which peg. I try to remember my grandmother's stories for any mention of a visitor in those years. 1973 to 1986. I was born in 1992, far after. My mother never said much about the years before she left this village for the city, only that the orchard got sold and the bus came twice a day, and childhood was something like a long nap punctuated by chores. I have no one to call right now. That is both a relief and a loneliness that sits down beside you and puts its head on your knee. The clouds outside are exaggerating themselves into shapes a child would be proud of. A rabbit with a limping ear. A ship that believes in itself. I used to make my students paint the same cloud 3 different ways in the same afternoon. The contour, the shadow, the feeling. One boy called his final canvas, "Everything I Can't Say About My Dad." I gave him an A without writing it down. Perhaps this journal is someone's "Everything I Can't Say About My Love," with a temperature pinned to it so it looks like data. I mark my place with the shopping list from my pocket. Soap, matches, apples, cardamom thread, and go to the kitchen. Soup seems a fitting sacrament. The neighbor's crate holds carrots, onions, a head of garlic, and what might be a misshapen parsnip. My hands know the old movements of peeling and chopping, of coaxing squares into a pan, of letting their sense become an argument that ends with laughter. The rain starts while I slice, drumming a cheerful tattoo on the window. I hum without meaning to. It isn't any particular tune, just a line of sound to mark my place in the afternoon. When the soup softens into itself, I carry it back to the window seat with a spoon and the journal. There's a page where the ink smudged into a tiny storm. Perhaps someone was crying, or perhaps a kettle hissed too brashly. The entry reads, "She put her hand on the windowsill and looked out as if petitioning the sky. I wanted to say, 'Stay.' I said, 'Soup?' My spoon pauses. 'Stay,' I say out loud, to no one, to the journal, to my own stubborn grief. 'Soup,' I add, smiling. The laughter slips out of me like steam. The day leans toward evening. The cottage darkens early because it trusts the lamps. I flip another few pages. She has a way of tilting her head when I talk about hurricanes, like she is listening for a train that isn't on any map. Fog that ate sound. We planted tulips near the fence. She buried a note under them. I did not read it. There is such restraint here that the smallest lines feel as intimate as switching on someone's bedside lamp. At the back is a pocket I didn't notice earlier. A thin envelope of the same leather slit along the top. I slide out a sheet of paper that has gone brittle around the edges and see that the handwriting has changed a little. It leans more now, as if the writer's shoulder has decided to participate. April 2nd, 1985, the page begins. Wind sharp enough to trim thoughts. She left for the city with a yellow scarf around her throat. I walked the lane with the birch. I will keep writing weather until the weather of her comes back. I lean my head against the window and close my eyes. The ache is old, the promise young. I should not be crying over someone else's unknown love story in a cottage that has decided to keep its secrets. And yet, I am. And yet. I think of the last thing my ex said before the door clicked. "You want to be alone more than you want to be with me," he told me. He believed it was an insult. I hear it now as data. Sometimes solitude is not the absence of love, but the weather pattern that makes it possible to exist without lightning. What if I've come to the right place not to be alone, but to learn how to be with everything? With soup, with wind, with old ink, with the way a journal can turn temperature into hand. The final entry, September 7th, 1986. Balmy, late thunder. The apples are almost ready. I dreamed of laughing like sudden light. The air feels like a story not done. There the writing stops. Not with a farewell, but with a forecast. Not done. It has the audacity to fold the pen and trust the sky to follow up. There are no more pages. I close the journal and put my palm flat on the cover as if I can feel the way the words breathe beneath. The cottage holds still with me. The rain has loosened into a dripping rhythm, meticulous and domestic. I imagine for a moment that I am not the first woman to sit here with a bowl of soup and a heart like a barometer and a question she cannot yet shape. It's a comforting arrogance. Twilight pulls itself into the room by its fingertips, equal parts smoke and velvet. I turn on the little brass lamp. Its shade is printed with a pattern of clouds, small ones, candid ones, the kind you draw when you are a child and want the sky to turn up and do its job. The light warms the journal into a darker brown. I reach for my own notebook, the one I bought for this sabbatical, its pages still shy, and write without thinking too hard. October 11th. Rain, the kind that listens. Found a weather log that might be a love letter. If weather is a language, I want to learn it. If love is weather, perhaps I have not been unlucky but merely out of season. I stop and then draw a little square for the temperature and leave it empty. It feels like an invitation. I will go outside tomorrow and hang a thermometer by the kitchen door and pretend I am doing something scientific, while the private part of me, the part with the softest voice, says what it really means. The soup goes warm, then empty. The room finds its evening shape. I wash the bowl in the square window and watch water clatter into ceramic. Even small noises have a cathedral here. Before I turn in for the night, I lift the lid of the window seat again and tuck the leather journal back inside its quilted cave. It feels wrong. I lift it out again and set it on the windowsill instead, where the first light will find it, and perhaps whatever promised story is in those pages will remember its duty to continue. Good night, I say to the room, to my grandmother's absence, to the she who laughed like light, to the I who wrote her down. Weather permitting, I add, because I am a person who makes small jokes in the face of big tenderness. Up in the small attic bedroom, the roof slants like a shoulder. The bed is made with blankets from a decade nobody can quite place. I slide under them and sigh into the kind of tired that comes not from work, but from paying attention. I watch the angled dark of the ceiling and try to hear the difference between rain on slate and rain on glass. I think about the way the handwriting warmed in the back third, the way love can sneak up on you through the back door of days. I think about yellow scarves and cities, and what it means to leave without explaining and to stay without asking. I drift, and in that soft animal space before sleep, something that feels like a promise stretches itself tall inside my chest. In the morning, I will wake into the kind of work that is not quite work. The arranging of a studio in the little room with the north-facing window, the choosing of a brush, the mixing of a gray that admits there are 100 ways to be gray. I will paint clouds until I can convince myself that the paint is speaking. But for now, I listen to the rain practice its vowels and imagine the journal on the sill, glowing with whatever it has borrowed from the moon. Maybe the universe kept a weather log of me all along, cloudy, then clearing, light rain, a chance of wonder. In the morning I will turn the page and begin again. October 12th. Damp. A woman at the cottage hummed while making soup. She laughed at nothing and everything. The air, like sunlight breaking through fog. And if nobody else writes it, I will. I came here to become small enough to fit inside my own life again. I didn't plan to inherit a mystery. but the journal has made me an accomplice to a past I didn't know I needed, a code I am suddenly fluent in. Maybe love is only weather reported bravely. Maybe this cottage is a station. Maybe the clouds are keeping secrets the birch will eventually whisper if I'm quiet enough. Outside, a fox yelps. The birch sighs, and somewhere between them, the wind pages through the leaves like a reader who already knows the ending and wants to savor how it gets there. I sleep. The sky keeps its vigil, and the journal waits by the window, warm with the promise that weather is never just weather, and that the heart, like the horizon, can change without warning and still be the same place you recognize when you come home. I started reading the journal the way you lean into a whisper, slowly, ear first, promising not to interrupt. Each morning after the kettle rattled, after the first slice of light slipped down the birch like a ribbon, I carried the leather book to the window seat and opened it as if it were a window that remembered how to breathe. Outside, the sky kept changing its mind, and I thought maybe I was learning to keep up. Day one of my investigation, and already I was cheating. I told myself I would go chronologically. I told myself I would read 3 entries at a time and stop. I told myself I would treat this like a librarian, not a granddaughter with a hunger shaped like a question. Half an hour later, my tea had gone tepid and my knee had fallen asleep, and I had wandered from 1975 to 1981 to 1974, and back like a magpie distracted by any glittering word. At first, the entries were as spare and honest as a kitchen shelf. Cloudy. Sunny, 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Frost on the apple trees. Then, as if a door somewhere learned how to open, a different tone wove itself between the numbers like thread through a plain cloth. Rain on the roof, she hummed while making soup. I never felt warmer. She laughed today, like sunlight breaking through fog. I kept circling those lines as if they were the edges of a lake I was almost ready to swim in. My grandmother's humming, her laughter. Yes, I could hear those. But the I, who had written this? The handwriting wasn't hers. The pen strokes were decisive but careful. That care reminded me of the photographs in the hallway. My grandfather's hand on the shoulder of a tractor, on the neck of the old dog, on the handle of the front door. I had never met him. He died before I was born. In every picture I have seen, he looks as if he has just told a joke to himself and is waiting to see if life will get it. On the second morning, fog pressed its cool face up against the window as if trying to see in. The world had gone quiet and heavy with its own breath. In the journal, I found an entry for a day like this. November 3rd, 1979. Fog settled low. Sound stayed close to the ground. She moved through the kitchen like a lantern. I whispered, "Of course," to the room. Lantern. That was the word. My grandmother had always had a way of making domestic work look like a parade, as if laying out tea towels could call the whole day into attention. I wanted to know more of them, more of how they had walked through these rooms together, the small businesses of bodies that live side by side, dissolving into a kind of weather you stop questioning. So I began making a ridiculous little legend in the back of my own notebook, since the journal never said it outright. I turned the categories over like stones. Sun equaled joy, rain equaled longing, wind equaled worry, frost equaled fear, storms meant something broke and then was mended, or not. It felt like conjecture until the entries began to agree with me, one by one, as if I had been invited to guess the punchline and gotten close enough to be forgiven. Midway through the third morning, the sky out my window bunched itself into gentle wool. The birch shook off 2 leaves that cartwheeled to the stone step. I wiped my thumb on the edge of my mug and read the example that would become the key I kept returning to. Weather, windy, leaves scattered. Personal note. She looked out the window for a long time. I wonder what she wished for. Wind, worry, leaves scattered. A thought breaking into pieces and blowing across a mine's field. A wish pressed to a window. I saw her there, my grandmother, a tea towel hooked over one shoulder, eyes stitched to the lane like she could pull something toward her by wanting it enough. The entry wasn't signed. None of them were. But the voice had a steadiness that felt like the stoop of a man who stood too long holding up other people's roofs. I put the book down and looked out the very same window, my breath fogging a patch of glass. "What did you wish for?" I asked the empty lane. The lane held its answer. I might have let the day drowse away in speculation if I hadn't noticed the other details tucked among the weather, dates that coincided with photographs on the hallway wall, with the recipe cards in my grandmother's tidy box, with the gossip handwritten into the margins of old calendars still tacked to the broom closet door. The cottage had been taking notes long before I showed up. April 18th, 1978. Rain and a mild thunder that never decided to arrive. Knees ached. I found a picture from that month of my grandmother standing in the orchard in a sweater that seemed like an argument with April. She held a pie plate like a trophy. My grandfather's shadow slanted into one edge of the frame, his hand reaching for the camera strap. Half of a laugh caught there. June 2nd, 1980. Hot and friendly, peonies exploded, her red scarf left behind on the fence post. In the mudroom, on the lower peg, I found a faded scarf, something that had once shouted red and now murmured it, tied in a simple loop I recognized as one of my grandmother's knots, the kind you can undo with a slow tug. January 12th, 1976. Hard frost. Even the dog refused to leave his rug. Her hands cold, eyes bright, soup declared necessary. The recipe box held a card titled "Necessary Soup," a recipe I never knew had a season. It called for potatoes, leeks, a bay leaf, and a promise. I began to source their life from these fragments the way you build a painting from underlayers. Brush strokes you can't see in the finished piece, but that hold the whole picture together. It felt holy and nosy at once, which is to say, familial. Each day I mapped a few entries to something I could touch. The radio on the kitchen shelf, March 10th, 1977. Wind scolding the eaves. Her radio outsang the housework. The dent in the corner of the table. September 22nd, 1983. Sudden squall at noon. We ate at the counter because the table wobbled with its own history. The little nick in the windowsill shaped like a crescent moon. August 1st, 1974. Sun so certain. She carved the apple place with her thumbnail while we talked. I had worried secretly that discovering the writer would break the spell. Instead, realizing it was my grandfather's hand turned the journal into a gentle kind of haunting. He had used temperature and rainfall to keep track of his heart. A farmer's son would do that, I suppose. The sky was his swear jar and his diary. He had measured his love in degrees and barometric murmurs because he trusted weather to tell truths people might not be brave enough to speak plainly. Sometimes the entries cracked right open and told me everything without pretending to be numbers. October 5th, 1982. Storm warning at 4 p.m., though I knew before the radio did. She said she might go to the city for the winter to work in the shop with her sister. I nodded like a man made of dooley. After she went to bed, I stood in the doorway and watched the orchard breathe. I am not a jealous man, but I am a weathered one. The sky held its breath with me until I realized that's what I was doing and let it go. Fear, storms, longing, rain, joy, sun. The words arranged themselves like magnets on the fridge, willing to admit a pattern if I didn't push too hard. On the next page the weather had cleared. October 7th, 1982. Morning bright like a square of linen. She said she would stay until the apples were all in. I said, "Good," and poured coffee badly, pretending to forget how, just to make her laugh. She laughed. I took an apple from the bowl and bit into it and tasted a sentence. On the fourth afternoon, in a patch of light that felt rehearsed, I found a page that steadied my private hunch completely. He had written it like an aside, cautious with its own reveal. May 14th, 1977. Sun honest as bread. Planted late beans. Learned it is possible to be in love without any proper weather term to name it. So I will call it high pressure. I will call it a sky that keeps itself clear around the edges so you can see what's coming and what already is. If anyone asks, the forecast is her. I pressed my fingertips to the words and then to my own throat. "Hi," I said, to a man I had never met who had been standing behind my childhood all along. I had felt my grandmother's love in the everyday certainty of our afternoons. the way she buttered toast as if feeding me were a very serious appointment, the way she ironed my school shirt and told me about the fox prints under the clothesline, the way she hummed and never called attention to her own music. But I hadn't known she was held like this, weathered like this. My chest stung in the best way. I felt allowed into something that had asked nothing of me, and I felt loyal to it in an instant, as if loyalty could be retroactive. In the evenings I found myself speaking out loud to the room, to her, to him. "You would have teased me for how long it took to find this," I told the lamp. "I'm on it now," I told the kettle. "I'm late but loyal," I told the portrait of the tractor. On the 5th day, the wind came up. It knocked politely at the corners and made the birch hiss as though scolding a child. I pulled my sweater around me and read. March 3rd, 1981. Windy, leaves scattered. She looked out the window for a long time. I wonder what she wished for. It landed in me again and differently. Wish is a small, dangerous word. I had been wishing daily to flatten myself against this cottage, to become harmless and useful, to be all windowsill and no mirror. But the journal reminded me wishes have edges. Wishes are weather fronts. My grandmother was permitted her own private climate. My grandfather had loved her enough to notice it and not interrogate it, which perhaps is the truest way to love. The journal wasn't only romance, it was also grief in code. Here and there fear slicked the page. January 21st, 1984. Icy roads. She took the bus to town anyway to visit her sister at the shop. I watched the lane like a man watching a fuse. When the bus let her off at dusk, she waved the way people do when they have survived something and want to spend the rest of their wave on joy. July 9th, 1980. Sudden storm over the ridge, big drops that wanted to be stones. She was in the orchard with the ladder. I cannot tell you how fast I ran. We sat under the porch roof afterward, both pretending to discuss the merits of different rain gutters while swallowing our terror. Fear. Storms, ice, thunder with your beloved on a ladder. I underlined, I cannot tell you how fast I ran, because I could hear his feet on the grass. I could see his hand on the ladder's side rail. Love is a weather alert that wakes you up before the radio does. I wrote that in my own notebook, then crossed it out because it sounded too much like a slogan. Then I wrote it again because it was true. On the 6th day, I dusted the bookshelves and discovered an old field guide to clouds, its cover soft as skin with use. Inside, in my grandfather's hand, someone had underlined phrases: alto cumulus, sheep clouds, cirrostratus, halo making, nacreous, rarest, pearly. Beside nacreous in pencil there was a note. Seen once, winter of '82, her breath visible when she laughed at how I was squinting at the sky. She had laughed at his squinting. He had loved her breath for leaving a trace in cold air. I set the field guide on the windowsill next to the journal, a little altar to observation. At noon, I tried something that felt both unscientific and necessary. I took out my watercolors and painted the day's sky, a thin wash of blue that hesitated at the edges where cloud thought about happening. Then a series of small, tidy dabs where the white gathered. Underneath, I wrote, October 15th, scattered sun, the house smells like toast. Found a sentence. Love is when you keep track of the other person's weather like it's your own. I didn't show it to anyone. Still, it changed the room. The neighbor, Mrs. Dalrymple, knocked that afternoon with a loaf of bread held in two hands like an offering to a small god. For you, she said. I make 3 on Sundays. 1 for me, 1 for my sister, and 1 for whoever is missing someone. I loved her instantly for the way she refused to pretend she didn't know. I'm reading their weather, I blurted. Oh, the book, she said without surprise, her eyes going soft at the edges. He began when the doctor told him to keep a record of his breathing in winter. It got away from him, or into him, maybe. Your granddad used to say he never meant to write a poem, and that's exactly why one happened. Did she know? I asked, voice low. She knew enough, Mrs. Dalrymple said, setting the bread on the table and pressing her fingers into the cooling crust as if it were a shoulder. He didn't write to keep secrets. He wrote so the truth would have somewhere to sit when the day got noisy. He read her some of the funny ones. Never the afraid ones, not all the way through. Not because he hid, because he protected. After she left, I found my hands shaking. Protected. The word felt like a coat hung on my shoulders by someone who had measured me in their mind 100 times and gotten it right. I returned to the journal with the mellow determination of a person who knows she is privileged to eavesdrop. I noticed a structural grace to it, the way great joy and small annoyance lived side by side and made sense that way. Like 2 vegetables in the same soup pot. August 23rd, 1976. Hot and sulky. The dog rolled in something ecstatic. She scolded with her hands on her hips, then fed him scraps and softened at his sigh. February 4th, 1985. Icicles like knives we aren't allowed to touch. She forgot her gloves again, and I pretended I needed mine less. May 9th, 1974. Sunshine all the way through. We made a cake with no occasion and called that the occasion. My grandfather had been a man who understood that even weather needs a little ceremony. My grandmother had been a woman who made allowances for everything except meanness. The 2 of them together seemed to have formed a climate I wanted to live inside even now, even alone. On the 7th evening, I lit the lamp with the cloud-printed shade and asked a question I was surprised to hear myself say out loud. What did you do when you were scared? It felt like a practical question and a prayer at once. I found an answer that was not heroism, but something shinier to me. ordinary bravery. December 28th, 1983. Snow began at 4 p.m., as if someone pressed a button. We were running low on lamp oil because I forgot to watch the little glass measure. She said, "Well then, we will go to bed early and pretend we meant to, and in the morning everything will be astonishing." I lay awake for a while, listening to the house try on its creaks, and felt fear's ordinary footstep in the hallway. I pictured it walking past and out the back door like a decent neighbor. It did. I touched the sentence, "In the morning everything will be astonishing." It rang through me like a bell. Astonishing is available. You can go to bed early and decide to meet it. The quiet realization arrived like a cloud shadow sliding across the field. This was his language. Weather wasn't a metaphor he reached for occasionally. It was the instrument he'd used to tune himself. He'd marked joy with sun because joy had warmed him exactly that way. He'd marked longing with rain because longing had made a sound on his roof he could count. He'd marked fear with storms because storms break and roll away, and you can watch them leave if you're lucky. My grandfather, who I had once thought of as a silent man in old photographs, had been talking the whole time. I simply hadn't known how to listen. I wondered then if my grandmother kept a book of her own, if she had let him hold the sky while she kept track of the cupboards, the guests, the secrets she wasn't ashamed of, the dreams that arrived while she folded towels. I checked behind the pantry door. I checked the drawer where rubber bands go to turn into snakes and dust. No second journal. But I found her handwriting in the margins of a cookbook. Use more cinnamon if sad. Double the vanilla when company is uncertain. Add a splash of cream when you want to remember summer. It was a cookbook and a mood chart. Perhaps that was her weather. I slept those nights with the journal on the table near the bed, as if it were a small hearth. I began dreaming my grandparents alive and laughing, dream weather pulled across their shoulders like shawls. Once I dreamed my grandfather and I were both standing outside in a summer rain, letting ourselves be rinsed. When I woke, my cheeks were damp, and I felt less alone than I had in months. On the 8th day, the wind had wandered off. The morning sat still as a bowl. I took my paints into the small room with the north window and set up a palette. The walls held the clean, stern light that makes artists tell the truth. I painted what I had learned, not the sky itself, but the legend of it. A small sun the color of egg yolk labeled joy. A thin blue vertical wash labeled longing. A smear of pewter with a white edge labeled fear. A soft gray gradient labeled ordinary day, a miracle. In the corner, I painted a tiny red scarf and shaded it like a horizon. When it dried, I wrote beneath it, her. I tacked the painting to the wall above my table. I didn't need anyone to see it. It needed to see me. By late afternoon, I had circled back to the first page of the journal and started reading in sequence, as if the book had earned the dignity of order now that I had stolen so many glimpses. The early entries were so spare they made me ache. January 6th, 1973. Cloudy light snow. Wind east by northeast. January 7th. Clear and mean. Dog smarter than we are. January 8th. Clouded over. She made bread. The house smelled like a good decision. I began to feel in those early days the way two people establish their weather together. That to me was the secret window this journal was opening. Not just their love, but the daily treaty of it. Where to place the boots. Who remembers the salt. Which silences mean I'm thinking, and which mean I need you to ask me twice. As the light drained toward evening, I read the last sentence on a page that would send me to sleep with my hands open. September 19th, 1986. Mild, leaves beginning to consider their options. We shared an apple on the porch steps and ate it like a story we both knew. Where it began, where it sweetened, where to set down the core. I do not know how I ever thought weather was separate from us. I closed the book very gently. I sat on the window seat and let my reflection settle into the glass until it was the one looking in. The room wore the kind of quiet that invites you rather than punishes you. I pressed my hand against the pane and thought of my grandmother doing the same, of my grandfather watching her wish something he would never name, of both of them tending to each other with soup and gloves and listening. Tender closeness is a phrase people use when they are afraid to say love. I wasn't afraid. I felt their tenderness folding me into it like a quilt I didn't know I had earned. I hadn't met him, she was newly gone, and yet there I was, pinned gently in place by their attention, made warmer by a journal that had gone on reporting even after the radio fell quiet and the house learned new footsteps. Before bed, I added one more note to my legend, in small handwriting I hoped would keep itself humble. Clear night, stars visible, gratitude so steady you forget to call it by its name. Then I wrote today's weather for myself. October 17th, calm. Read the sky in the margin of a love I come from, felt held. I set the journal on the windowsill again, where moonlight could loan it its silver. I turned out the lamp with the cloud shade and watched the dim shapes of the room find their outlines. Somewhere outside, the birch rearranged its leaves. The cottage breathed. For the first time in many months, I felt like I was exactly inside my life. No smaller, no larger, just fitting the edges. I thought of my students and how I would one day tell them that color is truth-telling, and so is weather, and that you can love somebody in the language you trust, and it will still arrive. Good night, I said to them both. And then, because the habit had become a comfort, I added, weather permitting. I didn't expect the storms to start inside the book. At first, they were what they had always been, weather events given a poet's touch, clouds and wind and the particular shades of light that only a man in love would think to write down. But somewhere past the middle, the air thickened. The entries grew heavier, less like the skies above, and more like the low-pressure systems that move through a heart. One afternoon, the kettle had just gone quiet when I found it. A simple, sharp line, as if the pen had pressed too hard. Thunder tonight. She won't meet my eyes. Something's wrong. It startled me, not just because it was blunt, but because it was naked in its uncertainty. My grandfather had always let the weather carry the weight for him, wrapping his feelings in clouds and frost and wind. But here the veil had dropped. He was saying what he meant, and I could feel his unease in my own chest, like I'd swallowed a storm and couldn't tell if it was mine or his. A few pages later, heavy fog. I feel it inside too. The words were so spare, so honest, that they left me still as the chair beneath me. I traced the pencil groove with my fingertip and thought about how people rarely talk about the weather in their own minds. How often we let the fog settle in, pretending we can see the road ahead, just so no one asks us to stop. That was when I realized this journal wasn't just a love story. It was also a record of grief, small and big, temporary and permanent, and of the uncertainty that lives in the cracks between days. And in those moments, it mirrored me. My own breakup had been slow and quiet, the way erosion works. We didn't shatter, we dissolved. By the end, neither of us had the courage to meet the other's eyes for long. I had been living with my own fog since the day I closed our apartment door behind me, telling myself I was free, but feeling instead like a weather vane spun in circles, unable to find north. Reading his words, I felt the distance between us collapse. Not just the decades, but the fact that we had never met. We were standing in the same storm, just in different centuries. That night, wind began to skitter along the roof, rattling the loose piece of tin above the porch. The sky thickened with rain, the kind that makes the whole world look like it's breathing. I curled into the window seat with the journal, the lamp beside me casting a small circle of gold in an otherwise gray room. Outside, rain started as a polite tap on the glass before it gathered courage, drumming harder. The sound filled every corner of the cottage, and it felt like the right time, not to hide from the storm, but to let it in. I flipped back to one of the tender entries I'd read days ago, one that had lodged itself in my mind like a song lyric I didn't want to forget. Rain on the roof. She hummed while making soup. I never felt warmer. I read it out loud. My voice was softer than I expected, almost shy. But as I spoke, I could see it. My grandmother at the stove, steam curling upward like the inside of a seashell. My grandfather leaning in the doorway, watching her as if he were trying to memorize a moment he already knew he'd want to return to. The rain on the roof above me became the rain in his memory. The cottage walls seemed to lean closer, listening. And somewhere in that space, between the words, between the past and the present, my throat began to close. I had been careful since the breakup. Not stoic exactly, just deliberate. I kept my grief tidy, contained. I let it out in controlled ways, a sigh while folding laundry, a deep breath before sleep. Never messy, never unplanned. But there in that window seat, with rain drumming above and the warm glow of a lamp at my side, something inside me gave way. I didn't just cry for my own loss, for the empty mornings, the coffee cups that stayed where I put them, the quiet that was sometimes peace but more often ache. I cried for them too, for the storms they'd weathered behind these very walls, for the nights when their silences might have felt as endless as mine, for the times they couldn't meet each other's eyes, for the fog they didn't know how to clear. The tears came quick, ungraceful, the kind that leave you breathing unevenly and blinking into your palms. And strangely, it wasn't terrible. It felt shared, like the storm outside had moved in, but not to damage anything, just to water what needed it. When I finally lifted my head, the rain had softened, and the cottage smelled faintly of damp wood and tea. I left the journal open on my lap and stared at the page, at the looping handwriting that had carried decades to me like a bottle across the sea. I thought about what it means to see someone fully, not just in their sunny days, but in their downpours. How easy it is to love the warm light of a person, and how brave it is to love their storms. In that moment, I realized something I hadn't been ready to admit before. I had spent my whole last relationship pretending the skies were clear, even when they weren't. I thought it was kindness. I thought it was strength. But now, reading my grandfather's honesty, I saw that maybe the real strength was in writing the fog down, naming it, letting it exist without pretending it was something else. The rain eased to a whisper against the glass. I closed the journal gently, as if tucking it into bed, and pressed my palm to the cover. "Thank you," I whispered. I wasn't sure if I meant it for him, for her, or for the weather itself. Maybe all three. When I finally stood, the floor felt solid under my bare feet in a way it hadn't for months. Not because the storm had passed, but because I had stopped pretending it wasn't there. I went to bed that night with the windows cracked open just enough to hear the last threads of rain. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't dream of running from the weather. I dreamt of standing in it. It happened on a day so still, the clouds looked like they'd forgotten how to move. The air outside was pale and cool, the kind of weather that feels like a polite knock before autumn lets itself in. I'd been rereading the later pages of my grandfather's journal, tracing the steady shift from daily forecasts to the deep tides of a marriage, the storms, the calms, the quiet rebuildings, when the book's spine gave a faint sigh in my hands. It had never done that before. Something in me stirred, a small pulse of curiosity. I tilted the journal, running my thumb along the inside of the back cover, and felt the faint edge of paper where no paper should be. A seam had lifted, just slightly, revealing a folded page tucked so neatly that I almost missed it. The paper was softer than the journal's leaves, worn at the creases from being folded for years. My breath went shallow. When I opened it, the handwriting was instantly familiar. Loops and curves I'd seen 100 times on recipe cards, grocery lists, birthday envelopes. My grandmother's hand. The ink was slightly faded, but the words were as alive as if she'd written them that morning. You always watched the weather, but you were my forecast. Sunshine, storms, and everything in between. I hope you find me in the wind. I read it twice before I let myself breathe. Then a third time, slower, as if tasting the way she'd paired the words. I could hear her voice in them, not the practical day-to-day tone she used for telling me to wear a sweater, but the softer one she reserved for moments that seemed to fold time in on itself. She had read it. Every word of his journal. The pages I'd imagined she might never have seen. The fog, the longing, the quiet admissions. She'd held them in her hands. She hadn't just known, she had answered. Not in the margins, but in this single folded message tucked away for someone someday to find. And now that someone was me. I sat there for a long time, the letter warm from my palms. The cottage felt different, less like an empty space I was borrowing, more like a room mid-conversation, waiting for me to answer. The words, "You were my forecast," stayed with me like the after-image of light. She hadn't described him as her sun, her rain, her safe harbor. She'd named him as the entire pattern, the rhythm by which she moved through her own days. Every change, every mood, every choice. She had set her compass by him. It made me think of the way he'd measured his love through clouds and sunlight, rain and heat. How he'd coded his joy into clear skies and his fear into storms. They hadn't been writing separately after all. They'd been speaking the same language, just from different sides of the sky. I don't know how long I sat before the tears came. They were different from the rainstorm I'd had in the window seat a week ago. Softer, almost companionable. These weren't for loss alone. They were for the enormity of being allowed to witness something whole. When you've been through a breakup, you start to mistrust love stories. You think maybe they only survive in fiction or in the early chapters before the edges fray. But here was proof, creased and folded, that some love lasts all the way through, storms and all, and still calls out to be found in the wind. I put the letter back in the cover, folding it exactly along its old lines, but I didn't close the journal. Instead, I carried it to the window seat, opened to a page in midsummer 1982, and let the sun fall across the ink. Clear, soft wind from the west. She cut my hair on the porch. I've never felt so known. I whispered the words aloud, and the air in the room shifted as if it was listening. For a moment, I imagined my grandmother leaning in the doorway, watching me read the man she loved, her smile carrying both recognition and approval. That's when I decided, if this journal was their language, I wasn't going to let it end here. I would keep speaking it. The next morning, I found a blank notebook in the top drawer of the desk in the small front room. It was nothing special. Plain cover, a bit of dust on the edges, but it opened easily, as if ready for work. On the first page, I wrote, October 21st. Weather, thin sun, wind low and cool. Inside, restless but softer than yesterday. Painted for an hour before tea. Remembered how her hands looked around a mug. It wasn't poetry. It wasn't meant to be. It was just weather, the outside kind and the inside kind. A record not just of the sky's changes, but of my own. By the third day, it had become ritual. Kettle, window, sky, pen, page, self. October 23rd. Weather, overcast, smells like rain. Inside, heavy, but not hopeless. Dreamed of walking with him, though I've never seen his face in life. Woke feeling forecasted. I could feel something loosening in me as I wrote, not erasing my pain, but letting it take its rightful place alongside moments of light. The wind picked up later that week, carrying with it the first yellow leaves from the orchard. I found myself holding the letter again, the one she'd hidden. The last line pulled at me more than before. I hope you find me in the wind. So I opened the window. The air rushed in, cool and alive. I closed my eyes and let it move through my hair, over my cheeks, into the folds of my sweater. And for a breath, I thought I heard it. Not words exactly, but the feeling of being recognized. I kept the window open as I wrote that day's entry. October 27th. Weather. Wind from the north, steady. Inside. Not alone. Not today. As the days passed, the cottage began to feel more like a listening post than a refuge. I'd step outside to hang laundry and catch myself studying the shape of the clouds, not just for color, but for what they seemed to be saying. November 2nd. Weather, bright cold edges, inside, Sharp thoughts, but clean. Baked bread. Remembered his line about the dog being smarter than they were. Laughed out loud. There was something comforting in the act of pairing sky with self. It made me notice how often my internal weather wasn't permanent, how fog could lift by midday, how storms could pass without erasing the morning's light. One evening I found myself rereading both their words, his steady year-spanning entries and her single folded reply. I realized the letter wasn't just meant for him or even for me. It was proof that they had spent their lives meeting each other in this language, even when the words weren't spoken aloud. And maybe, in writing my own pages now, I was learning how to forecast for myself. By mid-November, the skies turned darker earlier, the wind sharpening. I kept writing. November 15th. Weather, gray, uncommitted to rain. Inside, ache in the ribs, missing something unnamed. Wore her scarf. Thought of the porch haircuts. Smiled anyway. November 21st. Weather, rain that feels like forgiveness. Inside, read him again. Sunlight on her collarbone, a little lake I wanted to swim in. Wondered if anyone has ever described me that way. Didn't feel sad about not knowing. The more I wrote, the more I felt them both beside me. Not as ghosts, but as companions in the shared practice of paying attention. One afternoon, as sleet began to fall against the kitchen window, I caught myself whispering, "You were my forecast into the quiet." It wasn't to them this time. It was to the person I am becoming. The one who can read her own weather without fear, who can see a storm coming and choose whether to shelter or stand in it. The journal had been his love letter to her. The folded page was hers back to him, and mine now was not just to them, but to myself. To say, I see the clouds, I see the sun, and I see me moving between them. That night before bed, I placed my notebook beside theirs on the windowsill, both covers closed but still warm from my hands. Outside, the wind rattled the birch leaves one last time before the cold took them. I thought of her line again. I hope you find me in the wind. I whispered into the dark. I do. And the house seemed to breathe in agreement. I planted the weather vane on a morning that felt like a clean page. The soil gave easily, dark and grateful under my hands, and the little copper arrow winked at me from the grass, impatient to stand. I had found the vane in the shed among coiled hose and old pruning shears, a small thing shaped like a fox, tail raised, ears pricked, the letters N, E, S, W thin and sure. It must have been a gift once, or a purchase made in a hopeful season. I brushed off the dust, felt the balance of it, a promise to point, not to command, and carried it to the patch of garden where the evening light pools. I pressed it into the earth until the post steadied. The fox trembled, then found its center. A mild wind came up from the west, and the arrow turned with a crisp little breath. I stepped back, wiped my palms on my jeans, and felt something in me lift like a small flag. Not triumph exactly, more like belonging. I know, I said to the air, to the vein, to whatever listens when we name our private beginnings. We're keeping track together. I'd already begun sketching the clouds most afternoons, a habit that started as an exercise and had become a practice. At the table by the north window, I would make the first light marks. The spine of a cumulus, the flat belly of a stratus, the scattered commas of a mare's tail. I tried to draw what I saw, then what I felt seeing it. Some days the paper stayed pale and spare. Other days I let water bloom and bleed into everything until the sky looked like it had decided to speak in watercolor rather than words. The sketches gathered in a stack, the corners soft from being touched. I dated each one and, beneath the date, wrote a small note that paired the sky with what it had pulled from me. Thin haze, familiar ache. Bright, something forgiven. Low clouds, hunger for soup. The pairings felt honest. They anchored me like stepping stones through days that might have otherwise blurred into one long weather report. I learned to invite the quiet like a guest and feed it properly. Tea, a chair, a window. I left the window cracked, even in the sting of early cold, to let the house breathe more than just my own breath. The birch rattled like a soft instrument, its leaves turning coins and then confetti. I could feel them, my grandparents, not as ghosts, but as experienced weather. Systems that had moved through this place and left it shaped accordingly. A groove on the banister from a hand that steadied itself there 1,000 times, a chip in the enamel teapot from an evening too quick to soothe, a window latch that stuck unless you muttered hello to it first. I began to speak to the rain out loud. I thanked the wind for closing the back door when I forgot. I apologized to the frost for being surprised by it, as if it hadn't promised itself nightly for days. And sometimes, walking from the sink to the stove, from the garden to the porch, I would feel the answer in the small hair's breadth shifts that make up a life. A softness in the room, a pressure ease, an interior temperature that no thermostat could measure. I wasn't the only one listening. Mrs. Dalrymple started coming by more often, which is to say, she stopped pretending her bread deliveries were accidents. She'd knock, then open the door with the authority of a person who has never once knocked for permission but always knocks for courtesy. Some days she carried a loaf neatly wrapped in a tea towel. Other days a jar of lemon curd or a clutch of eggs whose shells looked like they'd been tinted in a dream. "I was just thinking of that book," she'd say, and I would fetch my grandfather's journal from the windowsill where I kept it now, within reach of morning light. Sometimes we would read a few entries aloud. Sometimes her stories arrived before the words did, as if the pages were following her lead. "Ah," she'd say, tapping a date with a well-worn finger, That would have been the summer the porch chairs learned how to squeak. He was so proud of those chairs until they decided to sing. Your grandmother said they sounded like a choir of mice with opinions. I'd show her the entry. June 2nd, 1980. Hot and friendly, peonies exploded, her red scarf left behind on the fence post. She left it there on purpose, Mrs. Dalrymple told me, laughing into her sleeve. He never wore hats like the other men. He said his head preferred weather the way it came. That scarf on the fence was her way of shading the tomatoes without shading him, if you take my meaning. And later, when the sun leaned, she tied it over his eyes and cut his hair to keep it from tickling. He was patient as a stump until she nicked his ear, and then he swore in one syllable and apologized in two. I could see it. I could hear the one-syllable swear, and I could hear my grandmother's quick intake of breath, followed by the kind of laughter people only allow themselves when they know they are loved past competence. The journal had given me the bone structure. The neighbor provided the skin and pulse. Another afternoon, when wind fretted at the gutters and left them be, I read to her an entry that had made me pause the first time through. October 5, 1982. Storm warning at 4 p.m., though I knew before the radio did. She said she might go to the city for the winter to work in the shop with her sister. I nodded like a man made of dooley. After she went to bed, I stood in the doorway and watched the orchard breathe. I am not a jealous man, but I am a weathered one. Ah, yes, Mrs. Dalrymple said, her mouth turning tender at the corners. The winter she thought she'd be needed, more than she was. Your great-aunt had a habit of inviting promises she couldn't keep, and then leaving them on the table for other people to clean up. Your grandmother was the kind who cleaned. She went for 2 weeks, found the shop in handsome chaos, and came back with a new way of tying a scarf and a story about a bus driver who fed stray cats meatloaf between stops. Your grandfather met her at the end of the lane with his hands in his pockets because if he'd pulled them out he'd have sprinted, and he thought sprinting would make him look young in a foolish way. He wanted to look young in a hopeful way. It says here, I told her, turning the page, October 7th, morning bright like a square of linen. She said she would stay until the apples were all in. I said, good, and poured coffee badly, pretending to forget how, just to make her laugh. She laughed. And she did stay, Mrs. Dalrymple said with a satisfied nod, until every apple was in and then some, and until the coffee stopped pretending and turned good again. We worked like that. The book, then the voice, a code and its key. Some days the entries lined up with stories I almost knew, in the way you almost know a song when someone hums a few notes. The necessary soup, which had sustained winters and arguments alike. The dog who rolled devotedly in the exact spot least suitable for rolling and was forgiven on sight. the table that wobbled until he planed it, and then wobbled anyway because a ghost of a wobble had moved in and claimed residency. One late morning, while the wind-vane fox faced south and held its ground, I read a line that had always tightened my throat. January 21st, 1984. Icy roads. She took the bus to town anyway to visit her sister. I watched the lane like a man watching a fuse. When the bus let her off at dusk, she waved the way people do when they have survived something and want to spend the rest of their wave on joy. She was afraid of falling, Mrs. Dalrymple said quietly, surprising me. You know that, don't you? Not of ice, of falling into a life she hadn't chosen. Your grandfather was a little wild, the contained kind. Like thunder you can hear but can't place. She loved that about him, but it scared her sometimes. Not the man, the size of the loving. That day, she paused, as if picking up a fragile ornament. That day she realized fear wasn't a forecast. It was a passing cloud. She told me so later, when we put quilts on the line and the air was the kind you couldn't see but could trust. I held that with two hands. A passing cloud, not the sky. I wrote it in my own notebook exactly that way, as if transcribing a spell. We matched another entry to a story I would have paid to hear again and again. August 23rd, 1976. Hot and sulky. The dog rolled in something ecstatic. She scolded with her hands on her hips, then fed him scraps and softened at his sigh. He'd bathed the dog that morning, Mrs. Dalrymple said. Your grandfather did it with the seriousness of a man renovating a church. And the minute the dog got clean, he found a patch of heaven that had gone to the other team, rolled in it like a philosophy. Your grandmother called him sir for a whole afternoon, as if he were a visiting dignitary who had chosen disgrace as a hobby, and then she cut him a piece of roast that could have made a bishop weep. We laughed until we had to lean on the table, the kind of laugh that shakes the dust off everything that doesn't need it. I asked her once about the darker entries, the thunder no eye meeting, the fog inside heavy as a hand. She sighed through her nose and looked at the window as if the glass might choose to answer first. There were worries, she said finally, about the orchard contracts, about the bus schedule that never seemed to marry the doctor's hours, about whether they were making something that would last without becoming the kind of lasting that turns into stagnation. There was a winter he coughed like an engine that had forgotten its instructions. There was a spring her sister needed more than anyone could reasonably give. And there was a year a letter came from a man trying to buy up everything that grew apples and turn it into something shiny and useless. They had storms, but they didn't live in storms. They lived in clearing. I turned to the page where my grandmother's folded letter rested. A message I'd begun to read like a prayer when the day felt unreliable. You always watched the weather, but you were my forecast. Sunshine, storms, and everything in between. I hope you find me in the wind. I held the page and felt them both, steady as the two sides of a pocket holding the same coin. Days arranged themselves around these rituals, the vein pointing, the sketches, the readings, the stories that arrived like warm bread, the quiet that rose like steam and settled in the rafters. I would walk through the orchard and count how many apples had surrendered to the ground overnight. Each thud a soft punctuation you only hear if you are respectful enough to be quiet. I began tying my hair with the old red scarf on windy days, a loop and a knot that felt like a conversation I had learned by watching. In the evenings, I lit the lamp with the cloud shade and painted the kind of sky that isn't trying to impress anyone. I discovered I could love gray without expecting it to be blue soon. I found small purposes for my hands that weren't antidotes to loneliness, but companions to it. Mending a frayed towel, oiling the door hinges until they sighed like contented cats, arranging the mug so that my grandmother's favorite sat in the corner where the morning hit it square. It felt like healing and like work. It felt most of all like good weather, uneven, daily, honest. The first frost glittered across the grass one morning as if someone had emptied a jar of stars at ankle height. I pulled on boots and stomped a little, the way I used to as a child when I thought cold could be intimidated. The Vane's fox wore a thin rim of white along its tail. When the sun reached it, the frost let go in a hush. Inside, the kettle boiled. I made necessary soup in spite of the hour, because necessity sometimes arrives outside business hours. I ate it at the window seat with the journal open to a page I knew by heart. September 19th, 1986. Mild leaves beginning to consider their options. We shared an apple on the porch steps and ate it like a story we both knew, where it began, where it sweetened, where to set down the core. I do not know how I ever thought weather was separate from us. I read it aloud and for the first time didn't cry. Not because the ache had left, but because the ache had found its place at the table and learned the house rules. Napkins on laps, elbows permitted when no guests are present, seconds offered without ceremony. When Mrs. Dalrymple arrived that afternoon, she brought more than bread. She carried a small cardboard box tied with twine and a look that tried to be casual and failed. "I found these in my attic," she said, already undoing the twine. "They belonged here all along." Inside were photographs I had never seen. My grandmother laughing with her face turned away, which somehow showed more of her than straight on. My grandfather at the porch rail with a comb in his back pocket and a patience you could plant a tree in. A picture taken from inside the kitchen of Rain marching across the yard like a polite army, the kind whose commander would take off his hat for soup. The red scarf draped on the fence had blown just so, a flag of domestic intention. We spread them out on the table like maps. Every picture we flipped added a street to the city I'd been trying to navigate by weather alone. This one, a hair cutting, the scarf tied around his eyes, her hand splayed on the back of his head, not as a restraint, but as an anchor. That one, winter. Icicles like organs hanging from the eaves, her gloves missing as always, his hands bare because he would always give her warmth rather than keep it. The dog, captured mid-roll and then mid-remorse, a whole parable in 2 exposures. "And this," she said, pulling out an envelope gone soft with age. Inside were 3 small square pages, each with a smear of paint. One a thin blue wash, one a thunderhead risen too fast for neatness, one the palest, tenderest gray. "What are these?" I asked, though I suspected. "Your grandmother made him a legend," she said simply, "for his birthday one year. Here," she told him, "so you'll know what you mean." He kept them in his wallet until they started to disintegrate. Then he kept them in the desk. I turned the squares over. On the back of the blue, in her hand, joy. On the back of the thunder, fear, but not forever. On the back of the soft gray, ordinary day, a miracle. I felt my heart open in a way that didn't hurt. A hinge, oiled. That evening after she left, I gathered the photographs and the paint squares and, with uncharacteristic efficiency, made a small frame for them out of wood from the shed. I hung it near the window seat at a height that made looking think it was its own kind of reading. The Vane's fox outside dipped its nose toward the east and held. The light fell through the window in its late autumn angle, gilding the journal's spine. I knew what the day was asking. It wasn't a goodbye, it was a benediction, the kind you whisper at a doorway without closing it. I lifted the journal, felt its weight, felt the lives inside it like a soft humming, and closed it. Not as a refusal, but as an acknowledgement. A story can be both told and ongoing. A book can be closed and still warm. I set it on the window seat where the mornings find first, nestled into the shallow dip the cushion has made from years of being leaned into. I placed my grandmother's folded letter inside the back cover again, aligning the creases with the care one uses in folding a flag, a dish towel, a shirt for a suitcase that means home. Then I brought my own notebook, the simple one whose cover had learned my hands, and opened to a blank page. The lamp with the cloud shade breathed its reliable gold over the paper. Outside, the apple trees, now mostly bare, shivered and then went still. I wrote, "Sunny, 68 degrees Fahrenheit." I feel a small warmth returning. The weather inside me is changing. The sentence looked modest on the page, like a traveler at the start of a trip carrying only what she can lift. It was enough. I underlined nothing. I trusted the sky to underline what needed emphasizing. I set the pen down and sat there a while longer, letting the ordinary miracle of a late afternoon sun soothe the surfaces it touched. The cottage carried the sounds of a place that knows how to be quiet without being empty. A clock I hadn't noticed before learning to be useful again. A robin dubious about its own plans. The faint conversation of branch to branch beyond the glass. Then, just at the moment when the light considered becoming evening, a wind picked up. The clean kind that has made up its mind and has no interest in argument. It moved through the orchard with the easy authority of a familiar returning, lifting the sleeves of the trees, rattling what leaves remained into more honest positions. Apples still hanging knocked gently against their neighbors, a code of light percussion. I stood, walked to the window, and unlatched it. The sash lifted with the smallest complaint, and then consented to joy. The wind came in. It touched my face, and then everything else. The rim of the teacup, the spine of the journal, the paint squares in their frame, the old red scarf looped on its peg. The room seemed to inhale and then continue breathing, the way a person does when given good news that has been trying to arrive for years. I rested my hands on the sill and closed my eyes. Memory and hope entered together, inseparable as weather and the world it moves through. I thought of my grandparents eating an apple in twin bites. I thought of my grandfather's careful script, figuring out how to tell the truth without scaring it away. I thought of my grandmother's folded courage, the kind that fits into a back cover and changes the reader of it forever. Outside, the copper fox held its direction, clever and sure. The apple trees spoke their small languages. Inside, I let the wind do what it had promised to do in her letter. Find me. And I, in return, found them both. Not as ache, not even as comfort, but as climate. As something I could live in without noticing all the time, simply because it surrounded me with what it had always been trying to say. I opened the window a little wider and let it in. And that ends tonight's meditation. You're welcome to stay for a bit longer if you like. Have a beautiful night. Until next time.